Welcome to Attic Raiders Retro Reviews, where today we're going to be entering into a world of magic as we continue our process of painting up the playing pieces from HeroQuest. Today we're going to be painting up a mainstay staple. We're going to be going for the Orcs. Now, traditionally these are going to have green skin, but you can go for whatever colour of tunic you want. For example, on the box artwork we've got blue tunics, but there's also brown ones. So obviously you can go for anything you want. And when I've done this, I've gone for a whole load of different colours on the tunics for my Orcs. Today though, I think we're going to look at a fairly traditional brown paint scheme on the tunic on the Orcs. Without further ado, let's take a look. First of all, let's just take a moment to appreciate the original paint job that I found this mini with. It looks like this Orc's wardrobe has been fingered by King Midas. He is totally blinging. Thankfully, this paint is thin enough that I can just paint straight over the top of without having to strip it. But if you do want to strip the paint, have a look at my stripping video for the best results. And I'm just going to start with a base layer of Elysian green, and I'm going to paint this all over the skin because the skin in this guy, there's a lot of it, so it is very important to get it right. And I quite like this Elysian green. It's got a nice limey yellow tone to it, which I think really works well with the Orcs rather than some of the darker shades like the original plastic here. I'm just going to paint this all over the skin and particularly over the top of that gold to cover it up. And once that's done, we can get some other coloration on there. I'm now going to take some US light green from Humbrol, and although it's called light green, it actually is a very dark colour. Now Humbrol, this is an enamel, so I've actually thinned it down quite a lot with some white spirits just to be able to control it as a wash, and this will now go into the crevices. It will pool in those crevices and it will come down from the highlights, giving this some nice depth and some shade and getting some more three-dimensional nature in there. That's added some nice depth, but it's muted that original colour quite a bit, so I'm going back and doing some dry brushing of that original Elysian green. Dry brushing, of course, getting rid of most of your paint off of your paintbrush onto some newspaper or something, and then going over the raised highlights with that very dry brush just to highlight them, pick out that colour. I'm then going to use a nice dark silver in order to pick out his armour, his chainmail, and for that I'm using this Leadbelcher from Citadel. It's got a nice consistency, goes on really well, and it's got this nice sheen. I need to be careful not to get it onto his skin that I've already painted, but it doesn't matter if it gets anywhere else, like onto his belt, his buckle, or his clothing, because I'm going to be painting over all of those later on. So just applying that and making sure it gets into all the crevices. I'm then switching from Citadel to Humbrol in order to use this polished steel. This Metalcote paint is really good because you can actually buff it with a soft cloth in order to get it to shine. I really want those highlights on the skin to stand out, so I'm just going in and putting some lemon, some bright yellow over this. Now obviously you have to dry brush very, very lightly with this, but it does work nicely to pick out those highlights and to give it extra detail. I'm now going back to that Metalcote polished steel and actually buffing it up. So I'm just using a soft disposable cloth here and rubbing it, and it gives a really, really nice shine, a really natural shine, which looks really good on weapons. Now that's a nice shine, but it is quite flat and one-dimensional. So I'm using polished aluminium and dry brushing that onto the blade here in order to give it a bit more depth and a bit more texture. Gives it a nice worn look. I want these swords to look really rusty and used. It's now time for the belt, and I'm just using a flat black here on a fine brush, being careful not to get it onto the chainmail. Now I'd normally do a brown leather belt, but because I'm using brown for the tunic, I don't want that brown belt to get lost against the brown of the cloth, so I'm using black here. This particular tunic is going to be brown, so I'm using a nice dark base colour here, and this Revel paint goes on really nice and smooth. You can of course have any colour of tunic, and I really like to mix it up with the orcs so that you get some variation when there's a lot of them on the game board. Do like brown though, particularly for creatures that live in dungeons. I just think that they wouldn't really have that many colours, and they're kind of gonna use and wear really earthy dark tones, so I like to use brown on creatures quite a lot. A bit more detail, and this wrist piece, I can never decide whether these are supposed to be metal or whether they're supposed to be studded leather. In this case I'm going for metal with this Leadbelcher. However, I have done other orcs which have got this piece as leather using a brown and then using some metal colours just on the studs in order to have a bit of variation. And then I'm going to use a bit more of that Leadbelcher just to bring out the stud details on the belt. Now I'm using a fine brush here, but invariably you might get some of it onto the belt itself. If that happens, that's fine. Just go back and use a bit more black like I'm going to have to do here and touch that up just to make sure it's nice and crisp. A bit more fine detail. So for the wrist piece I'm then swapping to this lovely brass colour. I really like this, and it goes in really nicely and pops against this silver of the Leadbelcher. I'm going to use a bit more on the handguard of this sword just to add some extra detail, and by using the same colours it ties everything together more and makes it more consistent. For the shoes I'm just going to go for some dirty wraps around his feet, so I'm laying down a base of black just covering up that gold, and then I'm going to do some dry brushing over the top of that. A bit more detail, adding some brown to the handle of the sword, just covering up that brass. It's then time for the buckle, and you could do this as a kind of metal buckle, but I quite like the idea that the orcs would use actual human skulls as part of their clothing and decoration. So I'm using this nice Wraithbone in order to paint that in as a kind of white colour. It's a nice off-white colour, so I'm also going to use that on the teeth, just using a very fine brush and being careful not to get that everywhere. But if it does go onto that bottom lip, that's fine. I can just paint over that with some dark green later on. Speaking of paint spill, it's now time for the eyes. This is by far the hardest part. I'm using this nice Ferrari Red here, but the eyes are so deeply sunk into these sockets with these overhanging brows that it's really hard to paint these in fully without getting it onto the surrounding skin. Do go over though, you can just go back with a darker shade of the skin colour and paint around them. It's much easier to paint around the eyes and to get that nice and neat than to paint the actual eyes themselves. And I'm just going to use this colour again just to go around the base of the teeth and to tidy that up, just to touch up the spilled bits of the white that's gone onto the lip from the teeth. I'm going to add a tiny bit of extra detail to that handguard just while I'm waiting for that paint on the lip to dry. Then I'm just going to go back over that dark green that I've used for the touch-up and add a lighter shade to that, using this Elysian green just to very carefully highlight the upper portion of the lip here, just to really make that pop and to stand out and to blend it back into the rest of the face. I'm also going to go over the cheekbones and the brow again, where I've added that green paint, where I want it to be a lighter colour so that it stands out a bit more. Touch-up's done. I'm now going to add some extra dimensionality to his clothing. I'm using this lighter brown and dry brushing this over the top of that dark brown. Now if you do happen to get this onto the skin, because this is an enamel paint, you can just use some white spirits on a brush, wipe it off, and that's one of the reasons why I like using enamel paints rather than just the straight Citadel acrylics, because you get a lot of control over them with using thinner. And I'm then going to use a different lighter brown in order to dry brush the wrappings around the feet, just picking up that extra detail and highlighting it. Once that's down, I'm then going to use a tiny little bit of beige, dry brushing that on just to get that and really make it pop. You really want those eyes to be a main focal point, and I find using a deep red in the deep recesses of those eye sockets doesn't show up very well, so I'm adding in a tiny white light reflection dot, and that will really bring it to life. I really want to make those recesses and folds deep and dark and really make them stand out and add that depth to it, which is just slightly lacking just now. So I'm doing some Agrax Earthshade, and I'm going to put this over everything. Now it will mute down the colours a bit, but it does draw everything together and bind those disparate colours. You've just got to make sure you don't use too much, and if it does start pulling, that you just use your brush in order to spread it out and move it around. That Agrax makes the blades look worn and rusty, but I also want them to look used, so I'm adding a slight glaze of this purple red. Now things like this, it does have quite a pink tone, but once you use a thicker amount and start stippling it onto the blade, it then gives this really nice dried blood gore look, which I really like. Now as I said, that Agrax really does dampen everything down and mute the colour, so I'm going back again with that Elysian green and dry brushing it on again onto the skin, just to really bring some more brightness to that green, and this really helps to pick it out and to add some extra life and vigour to this model. The miniature essentially finished. It's time for the base, and with all of my HeroQuest miniatures, I'm using a polished steel for the base. I really like this deep dark colour, which doesn't detract from the model when it's on the board. If you stipple it on as you're applying it, when you come to the buffing stage and rubbing it, you get some really nice added texture on there, which gives it a really nice look when it's buffed up and shining. It's a real minimum effort base, but it has that nice classy look to it that I just really like, and I think it goes well with the dungeon theme. And with that, it's time to add our orc to the rest of the horde, and as you can see, I love orcs. I may have gone slightly overboard with the number of them here, but I've painted them all up in a similar manner to what I've shown you here, except that I've used different colours of tunics in order to add more variation. So I hope you found that useful. If you'd like to tell us how you get on with painting, please leave a message in the comments below. Or if you've got any of your own tips or tricks that you'd like to share, please get in touch. Please remember to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed what you've seen here, and there's going to be plenty more of this coming up. Until next time though, this is Attic Raiders Retro Reviews.